All right, welcome to the Better Than Me podcast. My name is John Conover, and on this podcast, I get to interview people from the business world, success stories, and my whole goal is to learn right alongside my audience, ask great questions, and for those of you that are tuning in, you get to learn right alongside with me. And today, I have Justin Schenck. He just wants to go by Justin. No introduction. No, I'm just kidding. Justin Schenck, the owner of and founder of the Growth Now movement, Growth Now company, and it includes a podcast and a lot of other cool events. And he is focused on the topic of growth, which is perfect for our podcast. And I'm so excited to have you on today, Justin. Thanks for being on.
Dude, John, thanks for having me, man. I'm excited for you and your podcast journey. It's changed my life, right? I've been at the game for quite some time, but it's changed my life, and I'm sure we'll get into stories and all the fun things in between. But I want to share something really quick because you jokingly said that he just wants to be called Justin, right? And honestly, like, I'm good with that. Like, I think titles and accolades are bullshit. I think a lot of the things that I've accomplished in my life have been, although hard work, have been a sprinkling of luck. And also a nod from the universe or God, because I feel like I'm on the right path, right? And so I don't like titles. I feel weird talking about my accolades. There are certain times where you have to, right? Like, hey, we want somebody to listen to this podcast. We need to tell them that Justin is not some idiot who lives down the street, right? Although I am an idiot that lives down the street from you. But yeah, for me, I'm not a titles guy. But dude, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you sitting down with me and having this conversation though.
Well, from a guy who's starting out a podcast, there's been inspiration, and there's been people that have come into my life that it made me go, maybe I could start a podcast. And then I watch some of your episodes. I follow you on social media. I'm like, oh boy, if I do this, I'm going to have to learn how to do this. I'm going to have to get better at it. So for the audience that's listening in, I told Justin before we hopped on here, this is a little intimidating for me to interview on my podcast someone who is good at podcasting. This is like what they do for a living. And so this is really awesome. There's got to be so many cool relationships you've built over the microphone, between the headsets. And I'm looking at Bert Kreischer, Ed Milet behind you there on your wall, some people that I'm familiar with, a lot of our audience would be familiar with. You used podcasting to network and build relationships, and you built it all in this idea of personal growth. What's that journey been like for you? Maybe tell us a little about the beginning.
Dude, honestly, I had no idea what it was going to become. That wasn't my intention when I set out to start the podcast of like, oh, I'm going to interview some of the top people in the world. You have Andy Frisella and Dean Graziosi and Gabby Bernstein and, WWE Hall of Famers. Like I've interviewed a gamut of people, right? I didn't think it was it was going to be that. When I first came up with the idea for the podcast, my goal was to interview some entrepreneurs, figure out how they were successful in entrepreneurship, so I could become a successful entrepreneur. Because at that point, I had 3 failed businesses under my belt. And I was like, clearly I'm doing something wrong. And what ended up happening was 6 months before I launched the show, my mom lost a 20-year bout of opioids. And it completely, number one, it rocked my world. I went on a 3-month bender where I was blackout drunk 6 nights a week. And I had a coach at the time who was like more of a spiritual relationship coach. And she called me out of the blue one day and she goes, what are you doing tonight? And I was like, going out with some buddies. And she goes, no, you're not. You're going to sit and you're going to feel this. Wow. And so that evening I went through all the stages of grief, and I woke up the next day, and although still sad and all the things you go through when you lose a parent or anybody you're close to, but like I had this weight lifted off of my shoulder, and I had 2 realizations. The first realization was my mom didn't die because she was an addict. My mom died because she didn't love herself. And the second thing was I didn't love myself either. And so organically what happened on the podcast, and if you go back and listen to I'd say the first 2 years of the podcast, there were questions for me. Like how I talked often about self-love. I talked often about being happy in a rock bottom moment. I talked often about all these things really that I was going through. And I found out that like the podcast was a great way for me to learn how to become a better person. And that was the beginning of the journey. And now obviously since then I've done almost 500 episodes. Wow. Have interviewed some of the coolest people on the planet, some people that I've admired from afar who have become friends, and so many great things, live events from there and masterminds and all the things that have grown from that. But I feel blessed, man.
Yeah, it blows me away because it wasn't like you set out. I think so many times we allow our ambition to outpace our passion, and and we say, well, I would like to have a podcast with 500 episodes and I want to interview these people. You could have set out from the beginning, like, these are my goals. And it's like, no. I want to get better as an entrepreneur. I want to learn how to love myself. I'm going to interview some people and be a sponge and be a student. And organically, so much good came from it. There are things that have happened for you, Justin, that probably would not have been goals in the beginning because you couldn't have even fathomed it.
Yeah, dude. Well, if you think about it, 7.5 years ago when I started the show, I would tell people that I had a podcast and then we go, what's a podcast? Like, I didn't realize that podcasting would become such a massive platform. I didn't realize that you could do live events and build a platform off of it. I didn't even realize that it was possible for any of that to happen. But I'm a big proponent of consistently show up, consistently do the work. And if you're passionate about it, like, it's a lot easier to do so. And I think, and I think from that consistency, the success came. Like, it certainly didn't happen immediately. For the longest time, nobody paid attention. And then a couple changes that I had made, and then some different things that I was doing, I got on a stride where there was some growth and people started paying attention. And then Inc. magazine listed my podcast as a top 8 podcast every entrepreneur should follow. That article got read by 360,000 people.
Wow.
And so you can imagine that really gave it quite a boost and opened a lot of doors for me. And so that was a great moment in time. And then we moved on from there, and I continued to grow it and build businesses around it.
Yeah, it was like you got good at this thing and then other things came from it. Okay, so now I got to ask, I don't want to make this a podcast about a podcast, but it's what you do.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about some of the people. There are some of the people you've interviewed over the years that specifically stand out to me. I'm a huge stand-up comedy fan. So Bert Kreischer's in my top 5. Don't tell him he's in my top 5. Tell him he's my number 1. Okay, but no, he's in my top 5 of comedians. I could listen to him all day. I'll never forget his marshmallow joke, which is one of his early ones. I'm not even going to try to impersonate it because this is somehow going to make its way back to him if I do that. And then Ed Milet, I just finished his book, The Power of One More. And so from a pure entertainment standpoint, it had to be really cool to be able to interview Bert Kreischer. Maybe tell us a little about what you picked up from him aside from comedy.
Yeah, well, I mean, we both shared how we lost our virginity on that episode. So that
I said aside from comedy,
that happened, and it was comedic. I've actually, it's funny. I've actually had 3 stand-up comics on my podcast. Bert's probably the biggest one out of all 3. I've also had Drew Lynch, who won America's Got Talent.
Yeah, I remember.
And then I've also had a guy named Zane Lamprey on the show. And actually, I met Bert because of Zane.
Wow.
And so, these are all people that I knew prior to sitting down with them. And I, obviously knew the Machine story, and I knew the clips that were famous from Drew Lynch. And I never really watched reality TV until the pandemic. And then I may have watched Love is Blind, but we're not going to get into that. But beyond that, like, I feel fortunate to have these conversations. But for me, the big takeaway with Bert, because look, here's the thing, it's an entrepreneurial self-development show. My job as the host is to say, okay, I want to interview Bert. I have an opportunity to do so. Well, how do I make it a wealth of knowledge for my audience? Like, that's your job as the host. I always say your job as the host is to direct the conversation, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, what do I admire about comedians? And really, it's observation, right? And putting in the work to tell good stories. And so how do we relate that to entrepreneurship? Well, that's everything in entrepreneurship, right? You observe the people who are winning so you can then create that in your business. And you tell stories because people are attracted to stories. And if they want to work with you, they have to know you, and they know you through stories, right? And so I was able to really pull that stuff from him. But found out
there's got to be. Sorry to interrupt, because it just now it just tripped me into a whole new. So with stand-up comedians, for example, there's got to be other pieces, like they've got to be mentally tough, because making it in that space, that's a very hard field to make money in.
Yeah,
like you're either funny or you're not. And the other thing you made me think of is stand-up comedians that are good are expert communicators, and they are also emotionally intelligent, because they can tap into our stuff.
Well, they're usually hurt and damaged. Which
you're telling me I could be a comedian?
I'm telling you right now, the comedians are hurting damaged people who usually don't do the work to get better. So like I ask a question on my podcast to every single person. It's a 2-part question. What's your definition of success? The second part is, what are 3 things you do every single day to ensure that success for yourself? I don't remember Bert's answer to the success part, but his answer to the 3 things I do every day, he goes, I don't do 3 things every day ever. Like I don't have any consistency. I don't have any of that stuff. Right. So it's not like, his work is different than yours and I's. But he takes his pain and puts it onto a stage. They all do it, right? Yeah. Drew with his stuttering, and Zane with his drinking, and Bert with his partying. And these are all things they're not actually proud of, but they take it and they make it funny. So everybody goes, haha, you're a human too. And we all laugh together.
Right.
But damaged comedians is very, very common.
That's very interesting. Ed Milet, and maybe secretly, I hope this part makes it back as a way to one day meet this guy. He's become one of my heroes in the personal development space. I just finished his book while I was I don't mind if the world knows this, while I was in rehab. I read Ed Milet's book, and it was because of the where the title of that book came from, to when he talks about his dad beating alcoholism. And then here I was taking on that fight myself. That was one of the reasons I chose to take that book with me while I was kind of away from civilization for a few weeks. And maybe some of the behind the scenes stuff that the world might not know about Ed that you learned from. What stands out to you about him?
So Ed cried on my show, which is wild.
Wow.
But I think here's the thing. I don't want to necessarily say it's behind the scenes stuff. I think here's the big takeaway about people like Ed and other people that are massive in the self-development space. 90% of the people in the self-development space are frauds, are projecting something that's not true of themselves just so they can make money. There are few people in the space who are genuine, who are loving, who are doing it for the right reasons, who actually care about the impact versus the income. And Ed is one of those few. He is, what you see on the screen is just who that person is, right? And so him and I have stayed in touch from time to time since then. Just some text sent back and forth, and I always feel weird because I feel humbled in the fact that these guys take the time out to reply to my texts, right. Because I've been with them in rooms and I've seen how many unread text messages they have, and I'm just like, holy crap! Like, the fact that you take the time out is really, really cool. But I think real recognizes real, genuine recognizes genuine, and I think that's what he saw in me, I imagine. And so we've been really fortunate I've been fortunate that we've stayed in touch. But yeah, man, no behind the scenes stuff. Like, he's just what you see is what you get. That's just real life.
That's amazing. Those two have stood out to me, when I was looking at, who you've had a chance to interact with. Who's somebody that had maybe the biggest impact on you, or what was something that maybe for Justin Schenck personally, this was a big shift for you on a personal level, and somebody on your show caused it? Yeah,
well, there's always moments, right? Like, I'm glad you didn't ask me what my favorite episode was, because I hate that question, because I can never answer that, right? Like, number one, I don't even know if I have one. Number two, like, you can't do that just for public record's sake. But there's some moments that were cool for me as far as like childhood pinch me moments. Well, first of all, in the same week, I interviewed Bert Kreischer, Ed Milet, and Andy Frisella, all in the same week. Like, that's a crazy week.
Wow.
I also then the same day, I interviewed Diamond Dallas Page and Ricky Williams, the Pro Bowl running back, Ricky Williams.
Yeah.
So like, I've had like weird moments of like, wow, like I have time with these people. And like, especially like DDP, man, like, that's childhood stuff. Even Ricky Williams, I was in high school when he got drafted. So like, that's a cool moment. But I think for me, the thing that really stands out is a guy named Fabio Viviani, who was on my podcast. He's become a dear friend. He spoke at my event in 2019. But the story goes like this. I went to an event in Ohio. He was one of the speakers. And I was literally like, who the hell cares about a chef? He was on the show Top Chef. He's built multiple restaurants all over the world. Like, his business is now to about $300 million a year. But I didn't know who he was. I was like, who the hell cares about a chef? And I went to the event, watched him speak, was blown away. And I turned to my friend and I said, I need to be friends with that guy.
Wow.
Fast forward a year and a half later, he came on the show. We really hit it off. He then went to introduce me to 40 people individually. He led me to Zane Lamprey, which led me to Bert Kreischer. He led me to Andy Frisella. He introduced me to Albie Manzo, who's become a dear friend from Real Housewives of New Jersey. Like Nick Santanastasso was an introduction from him. And so he truly changed my life from a standpoint of like, okay, I must be doing something right. Like these people are willing to take their time to make an introduction or help me out in some way, shape, or form.
Right. I mean, it's like relationships are the business currency.
Without a doubt.
You're either investing in people and getting a return on that investment because you're hanging around the right types of people, or people are draining you, and you're either building each other up or you're tearing each other down. That I think that's one of the things that draws me to the podcast space. It's one of the things that's drawn me to what you call your Growth Now movement. Is it's a magnet for the types of people that have that mindset of, hey, I invest in others. I expect a return on my investment, in the sense that we're going to make each other better, and we're not going to tear each other down, and we're not competing against each other. We're givers. This was something I wanted to do because, there's got to be maybe phrases, ideas, mindset shifts that popped up during some of these interviews. And so it was almost like a word association. Maybe there's somebody, maybe the first thing that pops into your head when I say something is a face or a name from one of your podcasts, and maybe you could talk about it. But when I say adversity, maybe who or what pops into your head?
What pops into my head is adversity is a gift. Without adversity, we would have no reason to live, right? Like adversity gives us an opportunity to get better. That gives us an opportunity to grow. I mean, if I were to think of people with adversity, I think everybody, right? Like I think everybody's been through it. Everybody's story looks different. There's one guy who I'm friends with who was on my podcast. His name's Marcus Anderson. Marcus Aurelius Anderson, actually. You can't make that up. And he talks about adversity being a gift. He's a warrior, man. He really is, like aptly named, right? But he talks about how adversity is a gift. And so he'd be the person that pops up. But it's so true. Like, I think adversity is a great gift.
Do you think a lot of people look at adversity and they're trying to avoid it, run from it, mask it, go numb from it?
Yeah, no, most people do. Is that
the majority of people?
Yeah, the why me mentality. And so I approach things, and this came from Ed, but I approach things with like, life is happening for me, not to me, right? To get out of the victim mentality, get into the victor mentality, and realize that everything, if looked at in the right way, can be a gift. Like, honestly, man, the worst moment in my life is when my mom passed away. None of what I'm doing now would be happening if that didn't happen.
Hindsight's 2020. Like, you can look back and see it all. But we don't benefit from hindsight as much as we could benefit from foresight. So it's while you're in the moment, it's while you're going through the adversity. Can you see that this is going to be not that it's going to be okay, but it's going to happen for you in some way?
Yep, exactly.
Facts tell, stories sell. As a podcaster, storytelling,
it's everything. Like,
well, there's somebody that you recently interacted with, and I got this from John Beebe. Okay. So there was somebody that you interacted with at your last conference, and he was on a singing show, and I'm blanking. You'll help me with the name.
Jonathan George. Yeah.
Jonathan George.
He's right here. Yeah.
There he is. All right. So that the reason I wrote that down is like, I got to ask about this. What does storytelling? There's an art to it. Tell us about storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, well, so first of all, storytelling is what captivates an audience, right? So Jonathan helps people get their message heard, helps people be seen, and he's helped multiple artists like break through on shows like The Voice and all these other things, because it's the story that wins. He had an artist who probably had the best voice of all time on, what's the other show? American Idol. on American Idol, right? He was working with this
Right.
star, and she went and crushed it. And he walked up to her and he goes, I just want to let you know you're not going to win. And she's like, what do you mean? He goes, he's like, you don't have the story. Story is what connects us all, right? And so the understanding that your vulnerability within your story is what's going to make the impact in the world, because that's how people relate to you. So storytelling, without storytelling, you can make money, you could do all these things in life, but you're not going to connect with the people that you need to connect with. And you're not, whether it be an audience, whether it be customers, whether it be clients, or whether it be the right person to marry, like without vulnerability and story, you're never going to find those people.
So much of marketing, if someone who's an up and coming entrepreneur listening to this podcast goes, well, okay, I'm marketing a product, I'm marketing a service. What part does story play into that?
Well, it's the why behind you marketing that product and service. Like, why are you the person they should work with? Yeah, they might need that widget that you're selling, but why would they buy it from you versus somebody else? And it's the story.
It almost becomes power of association. If I can see myself like that person, it's why we use professional athletes and actors to market products, right?
Yeah, 100%. But it's also like, dude, I'd rather pay more money for somebody I'm relating to than somebody I can't stand just to save a couple of bucks, right? That's why story is important.
Wow. Okay. Love it. Self-esteem and self-love is something you brought up at the beginning. I wrote it down because it's something on a personal level. I'll have my little moment of vulnerability. There was something that came across that I came across recently that you kind of like can't get it out of your head, and it's this idea that I don't know if it's impossible, but it is highly unlikely that you would have a successful relationship with, like, on an intimate level with somebody if you've not figured out the self-love game. You're newly married, and you had to go on a journey, in this part of your life. Self-love and self-esteem. Tell us a little about your journey with that.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I woke up from that bender and I realized that I didn't love myself. I didn't even know that you could love yourself. And so for me, what
didn't you love? Because look, if you don't love yourself, you were like, what were you, suicidal? Like, I don't even think you take it that far. I think it's like, deep down intrinsically, there are things about you and you can't stand it.
So it was everything. Like,
okay.
there was not one, like my head could not wrap around the idea of like, why would somebody love me? Why would somebody care about me? I am not enough. What do I bring to the table? Like, all of these things, right? And the reason behind that is a number of different things, right? Obviously, I was a terrible student. My parents, although they were great parents, they had their issues, which led to what they call abandonment issues, which means that led to me going, I'm not enough. And so that's where it was born, right? It's a limiting belief that was burned into me as a kid that I wasn't even aware of until I had a therapist. And so I didn't love anything because I didn't see any redeeming qualities, because I was never shown that I could be loved. But the reality is you have to show yourself. And so for me, I had that realization and I was like, okay, well, why do I feel this way? And then I realized that society tells me, specifically as a male, that I have to go out and I have to make a ton of money, get the nice car, have the nice house, all these things, and then I can love myself and then I can be happy. But the reality is you're never going to find happiness unless you do the inner work, right? And so
okay, hold on, because you just triggered me. I'm going, yeah, I can relate to love equals achievement. Love from parents, love from a coach, in sports, love from a teacher, love from a spouse, a partner, whatever. It was, okay, achievement is how I get that. And even how I felt about myself has been oftentimes tied to, did I achieve anything lately? And then if there was a gap there, if I wasn't meeting someone's standards, and I could feel the love start to go away, right? Or if deep down I knew I'm not playing to my potential, I'm slacking off, I'm not achieving like that person's achieving, the comparing. Not only am I not maybe getting love from somewhere external, but I'm also now struggling inside with, is it possible to not be in an achieving mode and still love yourself?
100%. The part of loving yourself is dropping the expectation of external things in order to accept yourself. Right? So none of my worth is tied to my results. My worth is tied to, am I a good person? Did I try my best? Did I hurt anybody today? No, cool. I can keep loving myself, right? Like, it's real basic for me. And I found when you can finally get to that place in life, right? You talk about relationships and all these things. I was an ultimate self-sabotager. So the second I would find myself getting feelings for a woman, I would self-sabotage the relationship, and I'd be like, I'm out. And the reason I was doing that, because I had abandonment issues. So I was like, you're going to leave me anyway, so I'm going to give you a reason to leave me. So I realized this was a pattern in my life. And so I got a therapist, I hired a relationship coach, and worked through a number of these things over the course of many years. And then I found Lauren. And Lauren was somebody who had her own stuff, and she worked through it on her own. And when we came together, we were two healed people. That's not to say we're perfect. That's not to say we don't argue. That's not to say things are always great, but it is to say that we're willing to work through our stuff. We're willing to see each other where we're at, and we're willing to love that person no matter the success or the failure, because it has to do with the person versus the external. If all we're seeing in life is external things, like once I get this external thing, I'll have love, then you're going to attract people that feel the same way. And so now all of a sudden you're playing on that playing field.
And you guys have been married like a year now, and you guys are an amazing, amazing couple. I had a chance to interact with both of you here recently and meet the kids, and you guys have a great family. Was Lauren the first relationship that you had that you would say, you know what, I was healed, I was ready, and I had worked through stuff, and this was the first time that it felt that I got it right and I was right?
I was right, meaning what? I chose the right.
Like partner? you were right. You were good. You were centered. You were in a right frame of mind. And then she walks into your life like what, at the right time? Is that what happened?
Dude, neither of us were looking for anything serious. That's the best part. But I was in one relationship before her that I had already done the work, and she did not do the work. But the difference with that relationship was I knew I had to leave it. I knew I had to go, okay, I'm not going to try and fix this. This is not my job to fix her. And so then I was like, you know what? I'm focusing head down on my business. I wasn't looking for anything serious. I met Lauren on Bumble. She was moving to Seattle in a couple months. We're like, okay, whatever. And then by the third date, I was like, oh shit, this is going to be tough when you move to Seattle. And now, 4 years later, here we are. We're married and living our best life.
When you got it right, was there ever a fear? It's not just because you're healed doesn't mean you didn't like eliminate any fears. Now the new fear is, well, damn, this is right. What if I'm vulnerable? What if I go for it and it still doesn't work out?
Perfect. I'll be fine.
And that's what a healed person comes to the conclusion of.
Yeah. And it's funny. I literally just said this. I was speaking at an event 3 weeks before we got married. In North Carolina. I was speaking at an event, and I was talking about the limiting beliefs and all these things. We've touched on some of it in this conversation. And I remember saying while I was talking, like, I go, Lauren and I have had the conversation, like, if you ever leave me, I'll be sad, but I'll be fine. Like, we've literally had that conversation with each other, and her the same, right? Of course you're going to be sad. You lost a love. That's part of it. But the idea is when you love yourself and you've built your life the way you want it to be, you realize, again, you're not attached to external. We choose to do life together. We choose to grow together. We choose to do these things together. But we also know we can be perfectly fine apart.
Makes you feel like the phrase in the romance world, like, hey, that person completes me. It feels like absolute bullshit now.
Well, it is. And actually, one of the best things of advice I ever got was, remember I was saying all these things that I would self-sabotage relationships, and then I would tie my worth to somebody actually saying they liked me, all these things. I had a mentor at the time, and I'd gone through a breakup. And by the way, I've been on over 150 podcasts. I've never shared this on a podcast. So you win for this one.
Let's go.
And he goes, have you ever held sand in your hand before at the beach, like beach sand? I was like, yeah, of course. And he goes, and when your hand's out like this and loose and opened up, it stays in the palm of your hand, right? I go, of course. He goes, what happens when you close your fist? I go, well, the sand falls out of my hand and falls out through my fingers and all those things. He goes, that's an analogy for relationships. Like, wow. If you try and hold on to a relationship, it will escape you. But if you accept, let them flow, let them be themselves, let them grow in the own way that they want to grow without judgment, without all these things, that's when a relationship flourishes. But we think the opposite. We think, oh, we got to hold on. We got to do everything together. We have to be a unit. We have to be one. I just saw a statistic recently, how they did a study, and partners who are insecure in their relationship will share photos of the couple together on social media more often than couples who are confident in their relationship. And it was a fascinating thing, but it made me think of that analogy. Like, these people are trying to hold on to something that they're insecure about versus just letting it be. And I think that's a powerful message for relationships, because honestly, man, I was the guy who squeezed the shit out of that sand. Like, no, we gotta make this work. And that's just not how life works.
Wow. There was somebody that years back said something to me that has stuck with me. And it was how you do anything is how you'll do everything. And I think a lot of people might come to maybe a podcast like this, and maybe they're trying to learn how to start a business. And then they're like, well, John and Justin are talking about relationships and self-love. And it's like, what part does that now play for an entrepreneur who doesn't get this part right? Is it two separate things, or is it like, no. If you don't get this part right, good luck in business.
So I think that quote is absolute bullshit.
Okay. Let's talk about it.
I've always thought that, because here's the thing, right? That's like saying if one piece of your life is not going well, your whole entire life is absolute shit. And that's just not the case. If that means, hey, you cut loose on the weekends and you might have some burgers and some beers, that means you slack off in your relationships. That means you know what? Yeah, I slacked off this weekend on my diet. I'm also going to slack off on my wife. Like, no, like, I think it's an absolute bullshit statement, right? It's just not true. Now, I see the good in the quote. Like, I see where it came from and why people say it. But the reality is, man, we're not perfect. We're human beings. We make mistakes. And it might be a mistake in your business, or, hey, you might look, we're talking entrepreneurship now, but what about these people who are full-time employees that they clock in and clock out? That doesn't mean they clock in and clock out on being a husband or a wife or a father.
Maybe some of them do.
And maybe some of them do. Right. But the quote in itself, where when people say it, they're like, the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. Not true.
So you could be lazy in one area of your life, but figure it out in the other areas. Is that what you're saying? The whole how you do anything is how you'll do everything. I believe it came from this idea of, well, if you're a disciplined person, it'll show up in your business, it'll show up in your fitness, it'll show up in your relationships. And I think to a point that's true. You're saying, yeah, but you could take that way too far. The truth is, you might not be great in some areas of your life, and you might be awesome in other areas.
What I'm saying is, if you're a disciplined person, it usually means you're disciplined in all your life. That's 100% true. But that doesn't mean the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. The quote has gotten spun in such an obscene direction.
Yeah.
That I'm like, no, like, literally you're harming people by saying that to them.
It's too cliche and it's too broad, and it's not really good advice in and of itself.
Exactly.
I do like the idea, though, that if someone decided, hey, I'm going to be a disciplined person, it would probably show up in all their different areas of their life, at least the important priorities, right?
For sure.
I've heard Mel Robbins talk about that motivation is bullshit, that she does things all the time she doesn't feel like doing. What's been your personal experience with, now you're a successful business owner with a successful podcast, with you have an audience, good communicator. Are there days you feel like not recording a podcast?
Yeah, like all the time. Like, it's
like today you hopped on mine. You're like, I got to do this thing with John.
no, dude, like all the time. But you kind of do it anyway, right? And I think the reality is, and I think the piece that Mel, and I don't know if I didn't hear the clip, but the piece that you in the translation was missed, or what she missed, was when you know what your purpose is, you do shit you don't want to do because you know you have to stay in your purpose and you have to drive toward that larger goal that you have in your mind. But I don't think motivation is necessarily bullshit. I just think motivation is short-lived. To go and, I'll take a walk in the morning and I'll listen to some motivational talks and stuff like that. It pumps me up, man. But by noon, I forgot about that talk.
Right.
Like, it's just short-lived. And you still have to show up and do it anyway. And it's a lot easier to do when you are living in your purpose.
Purpose is better than motivation.
Oh yeah, 100%.
It's more
makes you get uncomfortable, man. Like, do you think it's scary putting on big events? It's scary launching high level masterminds. It's scary, speaking on stages. But I do it anyway because that's what drives towards my purpose.
Did you think you would be a public speaker? And I'm not.
It's funny.
I'm talking like live in front of an audience. Did you ever think you'd be a public speaker?
I think I always wanted to be in some way, shape, or form, but I didn't think it was going to be a reality. Like I stuttered when I was younger, and I stuttered because I didn't think people cared about what I had to say, which is really funny. Now when you look at what I do, but I didn't think it was a possibility, although I kind of always wanted to. Like, the idea of being on a stage lights me up, and it has my whole life, but I didn't think it was going to be reality. But that's what I do now, which is weird.
Last two questions, and answer them in whatever order you want. What are you most proud of? Brag on yourself for a second. What will you pat yourself on the back for over the last 8, 9, 10 years that you've been doing what you're doing? And then the last question is, from a business standpoint, we talk about, building a business, having a lifestyle, building financial freedom. I mean, if a successful business doesn't give you some level of financial freedom, I think in some ways you might have missed the point. You might want to start a nonprofit. Maybe talk to us about what you're most proud of, and maybe talk to us about maybe the freedom that you get to enjoy as being an entrepreneur.
Yeah. So I'm most proud of, honestly, my own personal growth. I used to be a real piece of shit. Like, I would judge people. I would talk down to people. I would just not be a good human, because hurt people. Sure. And I believe over the last 8 years or so, I think my own personal growth of acceptance, empathy, being able to understand, why people are going through what they're going through and why it hurts them. Like, I used to be the person where somebody would come to me with their problems and I would go, yeah, but you don't know how bad it really could be. Like, think about my life. Like, I was the worst. And so I think that on personal growth for me, because it's led to an insanely happy marriage, a really healthy relationship. It's led to the success of my business. And so all those things. So I would say the fact that I've been able to flip that switch over time and reprogram myself and how I react to things, and how I'm not a hurt person anymore, which is nice.
I think that'd be something that everybody would be proud of if they had been able to accomplish the growth on the level you've been able to grow at. I didn't know you that well 8, 9 years ago, so I can't speak to that. But who I know you as today, a polished podcaster, an interviewer, a speaker. If you're saying that the version of you 8, 9 years ago could not have done what you're doing today, I think a lot of people who are starting out need to hear more entrepreneurs talk about that.
Yeah, no, it's true, man. The whole thing is ridiculous because I didn't know what I was doing in any step of the way. I didn't know how to do an event. I did it anyway. I didn't know how to do a podcast. I did it anyway. It's just about one step at a time. What I realized is people look at their big, audacious goals, which you should have them, but people look at their big, audacious goals and they freeze in fear. But the reality is they don't need a big, audacious step. Like, you're not going to go from 0 to 1 million. Like, take that first step first, and then one foot in front of the other, step after step, and then you'll get there. It helps take the fear away for sure. And then you had a second part of that question.
Yeah, it was look, an entrepreneur, for some of us in the entrepreneur space, we start a business, we have financial goals, lifestyle goals, things that we want to accomplish where we're like, you know what, my business is going to end up being a vehicle for me to live the lifestyle and the life that I want to live by design. I don't have necessarily an employer dictating to me my schedule, my income, any of that. You've been able to take charge of that by being an entrepreneur. What does the freedom side of entrepreneurship mean to you?
I mean, it's everything. I think time is our most valuable asset. I'm creeping up on 40. I'll be 39 next month. And the older I get, number one, I'm starting to understand midlife crises, but only from a standpoint of like, oh my God, like I'm halfway done. Right. Like, and you, when you look back, I'm taking supplements now that help me live forever. So we'll see how that works out. But like, you're creeping up on 40 years old and you look back and you go, that was gone in a blink of an eye. Right. And so all that matters in life, like I can go make all the money in the world. I can go make millions of dollars. I can drive the Ferrari. I could have the big house. I could do all those things. Right. But I can't take it with me. And I realize that time is the most valuable asset. So my definition of success is to do what I want, when I want, with whom I want. And so time is our most valuable asset. It's the only thing that ticks away that we can't get back. And so for me, I don't work a ton. Like you can't get me on the calendar on a Friday. Pretty soon it won't be Monday or Friday. I'm usually done around 2 or 3 or no later than 4 ever. And it's a blessing. And I think because I'm intentional about it, I go, how do I make more money while working less? And how do I pour into my relationships that I care about the most in order to make sure that they're growing with me, number one, but number two, that they're like, we get to enjoy time together, man, whether that's Lauren or our friends or whoever. Like, I can't get time back. And so everything about me is like, how do I do what I want, when I want, all the time? That's the next step. It's the all the time part.
I love that. That's and I hope anybody that's listening in, I mean, I think defining what you want out of this life and not letting life dictate to you and settling for what's been handed to you, but deciding, I want to be done at 2:00 every day. Great. I don't want to work Mondays. Great. It's deciding what you want and then building a plan. It might not happen overnight, but building something where you wake up one morning and go, yeah, I designed this life.
Yeah.
This is the one I want. This is the
Dude,
life.
I'm just glad that you said it doesn't happen overnight. Like, don't get me wrong. My life wasn't always like this. I used to edit podcasts at 11:30 at night. Like,
right.
It was a grind for quite some time, but then you get super intentional about setting the pieces. Like, okay, like the next client I take on, there's certain parameters that I have to put on them. And then you get to a certain point where you can drop the clients that aren't in the parameters that you've created for yourself. Right. Like, this year alone, and I'm not afraid to say this, like this year alone, I've added 6 figures of income to work 2 hours a month.
That's insane.
So it's just about being intentional.
There you go. That's huge. Justin, I think I smell a part 2 coming at some point.
Let's do it, man.
You'll probably end up being a regular as long as you don't get tired of me. And thank you so much for being on today. I really, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you. This is great. Thank you.